Hi, it's Heather. Before we dive in today, I just want to remind you about Tuesday Group. If you've been struggling with shame or feeling stuck in those spirals that we're about to talk about on today's show, you don't have to face it alone. Tuesday Group really is that safe, supportive space where we can work through those challenges together, and I'd really love for you to join us. We meet every Tuesday at noon Pacific Standard Time, and you can find all the details in the show notes. I hope to see you there. All right, on with the show.
Today on Mother Mayhem.
Recognizing when you're in a shame spiral is incredibly, incredibly important because it allows you to interrupt the cycle. You can then take the steps necessary and you can start to practice self-compassion before your thoughts and your feelings start to escalate or down spiral even further. Welcome back to Mother Mayhem, the Narcissistic Abuse Recovery Podcast for Daughters. I'm your host, Heather Gray, and today I want to talk to you about shame and how it shows up for all of you in your recovery. I also want to talk to you about how you get out of a shame spiral once you do find yourself in one. I had a conversation with a listener who'd been struggling with feeling guilt and shame around some mistakes she had been making in her life. Ultimately, she opted not to share her story on the podcast, but she did give me permission to use her examples as cliff notes for the conversation I'm about to have with all of you today. You see, she had recently started a new job in a new company at the beginning of May of this year. The job had had a lot of new requirements for her and was requiring her to learn a lot of new skills. She'd been doing really well with the people part of the job, but she had been given feedback from her new boss that her boss thought she would be further along in her skill building by now, and that she had been concerned that the listener's learning curve was a little too slow for the company. She had been embarrassed by that feedback, but she also agreed that she had been slow to pick some things up. She then got feedback from her husband that she hadn't seemed really present at home. He understood that she had been starting a new job, but he was surprised that she didn't seem as interested in spending time with him. Instead, she was trying to learn new software for the job. The combination of these conversations in short succession just had her frozen and so paralyzed. She'd been crying a lot and was feeling her feelings, but she felt stuck in her ability to talk to her husband because she didn't want to let him down anymore by saying the wrong thing, and she was embarrassed to ask her supervisor for more help in understanding the tech that felt largely out of her grasp. She felt like she was failing in both places, at work and then again at home. It was making her want to withdraw, pull away, isolate, shut down, and, well, you've probably been there a time or two. You get the picture. Simply put, she became filled with shame. I know, and all of you know who are listening, that she had nothing to feel shameful about. She was trying her best at work. She was doing her literal best with the tools she had, and she was using time at home to learn more. Her husband wasn't used to that. He felt left out of it, and he wanted to understand more, but all she heard was that she was doing it all wrong. So let's dig into this. Shame has reared its ugly head in so many of our discussions before, but I want to get us all on the same page for a second. So I'm going to offer you a little bit of a refresher without hopefully going down the rabbit hole of things we've already said too much. All of you ladies know that you are going to be particularly susceptible to shame spirals. And the reason for this, of course, makes sense to you because we're talking about it for other daughters, but yet when it comes to you, it feels different. It feels as though for many of you that you're the exception to the rule. You wouldn't want other daughters to feel shame, but you're okay with feeling it for yourselves because you tell yourselves that you deserve it. We've talked together before about how shame is able to take root within you because you never had the emotional validation that you needed and deserved as little kids. Emotional validation was this foreign concept for so many of you. Honestly, your moms didn't validate you. And as a result, you began to internalize the idea that your feelings simply didn't matter. That's how the story many of you have and hold about not being enough started to take root and take hold. We know too that your moms fed off of the ability to criticize you, to berate you. And as kids, you would keep trying to live up to her expectations, only to end up feeling as though you had all been set up to fail. Over time, always feeling like you're failing to meet expectations led a lot of you to start feeling as though and believing that you were fundamentally flawed. Feeling that leaves this gaping, wide opening for shame just to waltz on through. Some of you have also really experienced unhealthy role reversal in your relationships with your mom. So instead of your moms taking care of you, you were the one taking care of them. And when that pattern happens, and then it tends to happen on repeat, you just come to believe in your core, in your most centered form of being, that your needs don't matter. In fact, many of you end up feeling as though you don't have needs. That's why in the moment when I ask you on the show or we talk about this, it can be so hard for some of you to be able to even name your needs. Now, your moms, they also oftentimes made the attention they gave you conditional. So you'd only end up feeling acknowledged by your mom when you were performing or when she felt like giving you attention because it made her look good in some way. That performative parenting we've talked about before. That in turn ends up creating the story for you that you're unlovable. And then you carry that story with you as you grow and begin to interact with the world at large. Now, we've talked too on the show about the different ways that shame can sometimes show up in your own lives. You might see it in your people-pleasing tendencies or your tendency to lean on perfectionism. Tendencies like that are rooted in shame. And then it creates this pattern of, for lack of a better word, self-blame and self-shame. You daughters often like to call out your own faults and your own flaws before anyone else can say anything to you. So that means you sometimes end up blaming yourselves all the time, even for the shit that has absolutely nothing to do with you. This then reinforces for all of you the idea that you're flawed, that you're damaged, that something's wrong with you, and that no matter what might be going on in any kind of situation around you, you start to define yourselves as the problem. So, of course, as we're seeing in today's example, being vulnerable starts to become really, really hard. It would be okay for today's daughter to point out her struggle to her boss and explain to her husband how freaked out she feels and be understood, but that wasn't her experience growing up. She doesn't think that would be true for her. She thinks it's all on her to learn the software without bothering the boss any further because the boss is already inconvenienced, and she thinks she needs to find that extra time for work without impacting her time that she would usually be spending with her husband. And you know this about yourselves too. Daughters of narcissistic mothers often do grow up with the sense that they're only valued for what it is they do rather than who they are. This conditional love creates that core belief that your worth is inherently tied to that external approval. This then leads to cycles of shame spirals whenever you perceive yourselves as falling short. Undoing a pattern like this requires relearning or learning for the first time that you are worthy of love, of acceptance, independent of what it is you might do. Now, here's what I shared with today's daughter who's at the heart of this example. It's what you've heard me start to talk about in several episodes now. She has to own it. Owning her frailties is of course going to be vulnerable. After all, really important things are on the line for her. She really loves this new job. She actually likes that she's been challenged in this way. And she told me that her husband and her picker were the one thing she got right in her life. So the idea that she was suddenly failing at that sent her spiraling. And of course it did. We acknowledged together that if her job couldn't support her learning curve, she might in fact have to accept that disappointing reality that even though there's so many parts of the job that she likes, this might not be the job for her because she needs a job that sets her up for more success than she's been feeling so far. Ultimately, though, I also ended up challenging her. I told her that she hadn't really given her job a chance to support her. She instead grabbed that Software for Dummies book, sat in front of YouTube videos, and tried to teach herself. I also reflected for her that she ended up doing the same gosh darn thing for her husband. She kept waiting for the job to get better and easier. She wanted to have it all figured out, and then she'd be able to tell her husband the overcoming story, the story of how she'd figured it all out. She never thought that her husband would feel forgotten or left behind in the process. And honestly, I got to tell you, and I didn't really do such a good job of telling her this at the time, but it's clear to me that she has a rock solid marriage. And despite that, it never occurred to her that she would be missed, that he might want to help her in everything she was trying to learn, or that he wouldn't want her to think she had to figure it all out herself. I bet a lot of you really understand her, though, in this moment, don't you? You all know what it's like to feel like you're just messing up over and over. And when that happens, you end up thinking that it's all over. Ultimately, I kind of do think our listener is well on her way toward working things out all around. I encouraged her to get her husband on her team by admitting what she was struggling with and talking to her boss about options for getting more proficient in the tech part. She had been trying so hard to just learn the tech that it was clear she hadn't really communicated with her boss how important it was to her that she actually learn the tech, how much she was enjoying the job, and that she was willing to use off hours to get better at it. Once we could get her out from under all of that shame, she was able to find her way and understand how communication could really help her get out from under all of that rubble. Here's what happens next after we experience shame, though. We don't just have a shameful moment, get out from under it, shake it off, and then get on our merry way. Once we realize that we've gotten ourselves caught in that cycle, we often find its sister, we often end up feeling guilty. We realize that we went left or right of our center. We didn't show up as the women we wanted to be. And then we end up feeling guilty about it. And while guilt can sometimes feel like the same thing as shame, it really isn't. So I want to break down the difference for each of you. Guilt is about what you did. Guilt focuses on behavior. It shows up when you think you've done something wrong or something hurtful. It's about specific actions or choices you've made. It might sound something like, I got so embarrassed that I didn't know how to do my job that I just shut down and I stopped talking to my husband, and he had nothing to do with anything that was bothering me. Guilt is that feeling we can describe as, I made a mistake. Shame is the feeling that says, I am a bad person. Now, a lot of that self-help jargon out there, it gets so focused on telling you not to feel guilty. And I honestly think that kind of messaging is damaging, and it creates a lot of confusion because I think guilt serves as our conscience. It's our sense of right and wrong, and we do want ownership over that because it fuels us to change patterns that aren't working for us or that don't serve us. Guilt, when we allow it to, can often help us in our own growth. Guilt can encourage us to take responsibility for ourselves, to make amends, to do better next time. Guilt creates space for reflection, and it can start to nudge us towards healthier patterns and more positive change. Guilt also works for us because it's temporary. It's tied to that particular action or that particular period of time. So it ends up not lasting that long. It doesn't settle into our beings and it doesn't take up residence. Once we've made amends or we've made the changes to our behavior, guilt should and often does ease up, even if we remain a little bit embarrassed by it. Now, we know that moving from shame to guilt can often feel like this crazy, impossible mountain to climb for a lot of you daughters. After all, you have been spoon-fed shame since birth. You daughters tend to experience shame rather than guilt because you were often made to feel like your entire existence was a mistake. Many of you have ended up internalizing the belief that you were not lovable and that you weren't good enough as children. So when you made mistakes as adults, you end up connecting to those deep-rooted feelings of shame rather than that sense of guilt over a single solitary action. So in short, guilt pushes you towards change, while shame is going to trap you in a cycle of self-blame and worthlessness. And if you're stuck in a shame spiral of your own, or if shame feels like your automatic response when things go sideways or when you've made a mistake, I want to spend some time now sitting with you and explaining how you can work yourself out from under all of that. You've heard me walk you through how shame can look and what it can sound like in that example I offered all of you earlier. You heard that as a single incident. It's my observation, though, that you daughters don't often just experience shame as these single, isolated incidences. More often than not, what I see is that you ladies end up finding yourselves in what is often called a shame spiral. Now, a shame spiral is when that initial feeling of shame deepens and it starts to spin you out of control. It pulls you into a downward cycle of negative thoughts. And instead of it just being this momentary emotion that passes, it starts to become this series of self-criticism and self-doubt that starts to build upon itself. So, in a shame spiral, one thought of shame leads to another thought of shame, and you end up scanning your life and your decisions, and you end up finding all of these examples and all of this proof as to why you are so deserving of this shame. This creates a really intense experience that settles you deep into trauma brain and further away from wise mind. I'm a bad person turns into I'm never going to be good enough. No one will ever love me. I always fail. It's like stacking negative thoughts until they overwhelm you, making you feel even more isolated, more powerless, and more stuck. A shame spiral creates this inner dialogue that makes you feel like you're trapped in a cycle of unworthiness. It's often triggered by shame, but it is fueled by overthinking, self-blame, and so many of your old wounds. For you daughters of narcissistic mothers, it is going to be so easy for you to end up falling into those shame spirals because you've often been conditioned to internalize that belief that you're deeply flawed. A minor mistake can trigger this entire flood of past wounds, and that leads to this spiral of thoughts that only reinforces your sense of inadequacy and makes you act smaller and smaller in all aspects of your lives and in how you all move through the world. Recognizing when you're in a shame spiral is incredibly important because it allows you to interrupt the cycle. You can then take the steps necessary and you can start to practice self-compassion before your thoughts and your feelings start to escalate or down spiral even further. First, you all think you deserve this shame. That is your burden to carry. Many of you have been carrying it around with you for so long, you don't know what your lives would be like without it. So before we do anything else, we need you, listen to me on this, to give yourselves permission to actually get out of that shame spiral. If you don't feel it right now, you need to give yourselves permission to feel worthy again. You need to remind yourselves that it is trauma brain that has you questioning your worth, but you deserve to not have to suffer. You are worthy of and deserving of peace and to feel peaceful in your bodies. It's my experience as well as my observation that a lot of daughters block themselves off from feeling better because they haven't actually ever given themselves permission to feel better, to call trauma brain what it is sometimes, a liar, and to decide for themselves once and for all that they choose to live a life without shame. So that's first. You need to do this part because we need you to have buy-in into busting up that shame spiral. And if you're preventing it from working, you're going to be self-sabotaging your own efforts before any of you even begin. Then, when you catch yourselves in that spiral, we need you to recognize it and we need you to name it. Acknowledge it. Tell yourself, I'm in a shame spiral right now. Just doing this can shift you from being in the spiral to observing yourself from outside of it. Naming it actually reduces the power and the hold it has on you. Once you catch it, you have to start inserting those grounding techniques we talk so often about. You're going to want to ground yourself to be in the present moment. And remember, we've had you do this before. You can go through those 5 senses, things you can taste, touch, smell, see, and feel. Grounding yourself can disrupt those racing thoughts because we know shame and we know its spiral is really, really quick. Then we want you talking back to it. Ask yourself if the thoughts fueling the shame spiral are facts or if they might be assumptions. A common thought in a shame spiral might be, I'm a failure. Challenge it by asking, is this objectively true? Might I be catastrophizing just a bit? Often you'll find that the thought is exaggerated and it's rooted in those past wounds rather than in any kind of present reality. Then, in addition to talking back to it, you have to start collecting the evidence to the contrary. Trauma brain, we know this, I've talked about this before, is hardwired at this point to collect so much proof positive of why you were awful and why you deserve awful things. So now we have to train it to look for the opposite, to find all of the proof positive that the things you have been thinking about yourself are so very, very wrong. Separating yourself from that shame means talking to yourself with compassion. Instead of letting the shame define you, speak to yourself the way you would want another daughter who's struggling with this very thing to speak to herself. You might say, I made a mistake, but that doesn't mean I'm unworthy or that I'm unlovable. Everyone makes mistakes, and I'm learning. Self-compassion helps you soften the harshness that can so often accompany the spiral. I also really like making this practice physical whenever possible. Sometimes it can feel like trauma work is talking to yourselves until you're blue in the face. And oftentimes, in all honesty, it is exactly that. But I want you to try this for a second. Place your hand over your heart. Engage in that deep breathing we've talked so often about on the show, the kind that starts at your toes, works its way all the way up to the tippity top of your head, and then all the way out and out through your toes. And while doing those things, having your hand on your heart and doing that deep breathing, I want you to keep repeating to yourself, I'm doing the best I can, and I'm worthy of love and I'm worthy of care, even when I make mistakes. I like the idea of doing this regularly. It cements the kind of thoughts you want to be having into your being. So if you can start a daily practice of doing something like this, you will end up having an easier time calling upon those kinds of thoughts and beliefs when you do need them at the ready in a moment of hurt or pain. Another helpful strategy that I really like is getting you to shift your focus. Shame spirals often make you focus on what's wrong with you. Try shifting that list in your gaze to, what can I learn from this? Or what is a small step I can take right now to move myself forward? Reframing breaks that cycle of self-blame and it moves you toward problem solving or self-growth sometimes. Our listener today also gave us another important strategy that's really important for all of you to remember. She talked to someone she trusted. Yes, she walled off from her husband and from her boss, but she felt connected to me through the show and she reached out to me. And when I challenged her thinking and tried to get her more in wise mind, she let me. It's important in these moments that you decrease any of this self-imposed isolation you might be choosing. Because, like I've said, shame does tend to keep you playing small and it tends to make you hide, but it cannot exist in the light. Shame cannot exist in the light. So call a friend, talk to a trusted family member or a therapist. Get those thoughts that are carving you from the inside of your body out. Get those thoughts out. That way, you can truly begin to separate yourself from them. If you've been caught in a shame spiral before, you likely know that you have denied yourselves that kind of comfort, that you don't take the warm bath, that you don't read the book, you don't nurture yourselves because you don't think you deserve any of it. But by allowing yourselves comfort, you start to disrupt that narrative. By nurturing yourself physically, you mentally and emotionally confirm for yourselves that you are worthy of nurturance and you are worthy of belonging. Try setting yourselves up for success. Clark is really going to love this one because this is actually a really good example where I love cleaning and decluttering as a solution. You heard me talk a couple of weeks ago when I said the exact opposite. But you can break a shame spiral by completing one task, checking one thing off the list, bringing yourself from chaos to calm by completing and doing one thing. Taking action is always going to help you feel more in control of your life. We know you're all going to be works in progress on this, but it is so important that you regularly practice self-acceptance. One of the most powerful ways to counter shame is to remind yourself that everyone makes mistakes, everyone has flaws, you're human, and being imperfect doesn't make you unworthy of love or acceptance. Now, you know me, this isn't going to surprise any of you at this point, but I love me a good mantra. I love me a good affirmation in these situations because I like to give daughters something else to think about instead of whatever spiraling thoughts they find themselves having. This isn't going to surprise any of you either, but personally, in my own life, I really like music for this. I have a playlist of songs that empower me and that can change my thinking when I'm feeling a little bit like shit about myself. But you might pick up a word or a phrase. In my own life, I've found different seasons bring different phrases, and many of my affirmations do tend to be song lyrics. My husband is such a fan of that technique, I promise. He absolutely, positively loves it when a song lyric is stuck in my head and I just keep repeating that one line over and over. It really is quite charming, I promise. Seriously, you don't have to do this with an audience. In fact, I probably recommend that you not. But there is so much data and science that backs me on this one, that affirmations and mantras are really important tools when you're trying to bust those limiting beliefs. Whatever kind of shame spiral you find yourselves in, you can interrupt it with awareness, with compassion, and by choosing new actions. Shame is powerful, and it is a really painful emotion. We know that for you daughters, its roots of unworthiness tend to run deep. It's important that you remember that while shame might show up in your lives, it doesn't have to control you, and it certainly doesn't have to live there. By recognizing when you're in that shame spiral, you can pause, you can challenge the negative thoughts, you can offer yourselves the same compassion you would offer any other daughter with self-awareness with reframing, and with reaching out for support, you're going to be able to break free from that cycle of shame that can keep so many of you daughters stuck. And you'll be able to move toward a healthier, more loving relationship with yourself. Shame doesn't define you, it's just a moment, and moments can always be shifted. The more you practice interrupting the spiral and reminding yourselves of your own inherent worth, the more you can step into that place of healing and self-acceptance. And at this point, you're probably able to say it with me, but Tuesday group is a really good place for this. It is really welcoming, and you're going to be able to tackle this and get ahead of it because we know, like I said earlier, shame cannot exist in the light. So, if you happen to find yourself free on any random Tuesday at noon Pacific Standard Time, I do hope you find your way to that link in the show notes, and I hope you'll consider joining us for Tuesday group. All of you are in this community of women around the world who are having these hard conversations with themselves, and I most definitely am in it with you too. Bye for now. I do hope you enjoyed today's conversation. If you have a question you'd like me to consider for the show, please do email me over at heather@daughtersnpd.com. You are always welcome to share your story or questions by recording yourself using the voice app on your phone. For best recording quality, please do record directly into your phone without using headphones or Bluetooth speakers. We're building an incredible community as well over on Instagram, and I'd love to see you over there too. You can find us at Daughters NPD. Lastly, if you love what you've been hearing here on Mayhem and have found the show helpful in your own trauma recovery, please do consider becoming a Mother Mayhem sponsor by purchasing Simple Scripts for Saying Hard Things. It's a resource I created that provides the right words for the hard conversations, and it covers life, love, and work. You'll find a link for that in the show notes. If you know another woman who needs this conversation in her life, please do share the show with her. Your reviews and social shares help spread the word, and I hope you'll consider doing so. Special thanks to Heather Clark for editing the show. She's in my head and knows what I meant to say when the words come out backwards. Thanks so much for your time today. As always, I'm in it with you. Bye for now.